Hi, everybody. I am very honored to have Steve Young here today, and we're going to talk about his new book. It is called A Fool's Wisdom. I've been reading it. It is very interesting. I couldn't put it down, especially part one, which is what we're going to cover today. Before we get into that, I thought it'd be helpful for Steve, just quickly, can you tell us your background, and especially your education and your experiences that informed writing this book?
Sure, yes. So I grew up in Scotland, where I'm living now, and went to university in St Andrews to study for a Master's of Science in Theoretical Physics. And this led me down a path of, well, after university, I carried on. I went in to do a PhD in theoretical nuclear physics. So I was in education till I was about 25. My story is that after I left education with my PhD and all this sort of 10 years of physics knowledge and research, I found it very hard to get a job. In fact, I spent 6 months unemployed, applying for jobs in all kinds of sectors and not really getting any traction. Kind of feeling like I didn't really have any skills that were useful to people in the real world. And anyway, so I got a job in the IT industry for 5 years. I was working on NFC payment technology. So about 20 years ago, I was doing the initial testing and specifications for the contactless payment cards, MasterCard, PayPass, and all that. So I was writing the specs for all that stuff. But during that whole time, I just wanted to kind of get out and be my own boss and do my own thing. I'd been into music my whole life, making music as a hobby, and I sensed an opportunity to really go full time with that. So I quit my job in 2010. I went full time just making music and DJing and doing shows, and that was kind of what I was doing right through to like 2020. But of course, the whole time I was still researching. I mean, as a full time musician, you don't spend like every waking hour making music. Of course, still reading and researching and trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out what's really true and fundamental. And went down all the conspiracy rabbit holes. And Yeah, and then I guess in 2020, when everything kind of changed, there was a big awakening and a big sort of shake up in the world, and I found myself just disagreeing with everything that was going on, not participating in the COVID thing, and this led me to other people who were questioning the science. And I met lots of other scientists from different disciplines and different professions over those years who were all questioning what was going on, not just in relation to viruses and COVID, but also in relation to the what we've been told about the world we live in, and physics and science in general. Really, just putting it all under the spotlight and scrutinizing it and saying what is true and useful and what is not. And so I wrote a book between sort of 2021 and 2024. I wrote the book to really kind of put together a thesis that challenges modern science, specifically theoretical science. I'm not challenging anything which is practical or proven. I'm challenging the things that are questionable. And yeah, and I'm also talking about alchemy, which is an ancient science common to all ancient civilizations that I feel explains everything perfectly well. So that was kind of the aim of the book. So yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. Like I said, I couldn't put it down. I find it very interesting. The whole point of my podcast and my Substack is called The Great Wake Up, and the idea is that we want to confront what the truth is and try to find out what is really going on. Interestingly, I don't know if you know who Dr. Nass is, but she works with the Children's Defense Fund. I had her on a few months ago, and I follow her Substack. She had a Substack this week called was something like "Is Everything a Lie?" And so I thought about it was very apt before this conversation because what you're talking about, I'm going to read this in just one moment here. What you're talking about is scientism and looking at what we would consider to be mainstream truth, like just the common assumptions that underlie our conception of reality. But you're contesting that in this book. So what I found very interesting, you said this, if you don't mind rereading here, because we're going to get into this. There are five main belief systems that form the foundation of all modern scientism. And these are sacred cows that you're talking about that must never be questioned or criticized. If you do, you'll likely be deemed a fool, alienated by your family, kicked out of your job, uninvited from social activities. So that sounds like a good place to start this conversation. So there are five of them. There are five elemental theories that we're going to talk about today, and I want to say thanks again for even having this conversation. I'm going to just read them off real quick, and then I'd like to go through them one by one. I do know that the way that you present it in the book is that you build upon each one, or at least each one kind of builds upon itself. It creates a certain worldview, if you will. Each one grows more complex based on what came before. So it begins with atomism, excuse me, gravity, heliocentrism, evolution, and then germ theory. So those are the five that we're going to cover today. And like I mentioned before, I think it's interesting that you go from more simple to more complex. So let's begin with atomism. That's a hard word to say. Let's start there. If you could talk to me about why is that the fundamental thing that scientism is based upon, and how are you challenging that idea?
Yes, well, atomism was really sort of my area of specialty as a nuclear physicist. Nuclear physics is really a kind of atomic physics. It's sort of like the next level down from atomic physics. Um, and yeah, I mean, very early on in physics education, I mean, guess maybe like second, third year of high school, it all becomes about atoms. Very quickly, it's like physics education in the beginning is like electronics and mechanics and things like that, and then it gets more complex and more abstract. And in secondary school, you start getting into atoms and quantum physics and all that, and then the university education is like heavy, heavy quantum physics and all this. So it's all about atoms, and you do tons and tons of work actually, like calculating models of atoms and what happens if this atom, hits this atom, and doing all these calculations. And they're complicated calculations. And I spent a lot of time doing that, modeling nuclear reactions, atomic reactions, and so on. Anyway, as the years went on after I left, I kept looking to see, is there really any evidence of these atoms that we keep talking about? This was sort of spurred on by a number of other things that I started to question, like questioning the shape of the Earth, the motion of the Earth, questioning whether viruses are real. It sort of led me to this, point of like being, well, what about atoms? What about nuclei, electrons, protons, and neutrons? These three particles that we're told are the most fundamental kind of matter in the universe. Do they really exist? Because I was just working with equations and models the whole time. I never, held one of these things in my hand. I never saw them in any sort of real way. They're so far beyond the realm of human senses. It's very abstract. And so, how do we know if the theory's any good? Well, you have to look to the fruits. And this is again from the Bible. It's like if you want to know if something is good or bad, look to the fruits. Basically taste the fruit. Like what is produced from this process? Look at it, taste it. Is it any good? And when you look at atomism, well, the only application of atomic theory that allegedly really proves that it's a real theory is the bomb, the nuclear bomb, right? The atomic bomb. That was like the first, application of atomic physics. Now, they tell us atomic theory goes back to ancient Greece, like 2,500 years ago. So thousands of years they've had this theory of atoms, but the first thing they actually managed to do with it is just build this huge bomb. It's a bit suspicious. So then when I started looking into the bomb, I found that actually, well, yes, there was these huge bombs, but were they really nuclear? Were they really atomic? Or were they just bombs? Just regular bombs, just explosions like any other, but bigger. Because you can make bombs as big as you want. There's no really any limit to how much you can scale up with bombs. So when we look for the evidence of the sort of nuclearity of these bombs, it's just not there. There's the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They just built right back after the bombs were dropped. There wasn't this nuclear fallout, which we're told there would be. If it was really, atoms decaying and all this, there would be this fallout for thousands of years where, no one would be able to live there, and it would be really terrible. But we find no evidence of this nuclear fallout, only evidence of big explosions. Um, so there's some other things as well, some more modern things. When I really questioned them, I found, it wasn't really an application of atomic theory. Like the television, for example, the cathode rays in televisions, they say, if you look on Wikipedia or something, it will say that that was an application of quantum theory. Like because of quantum theory, they figured out how to make these cathode rays and how to make a TV screen, show its image and stuff. But when I really looked into it, I found it was actually just an application of engineering. It was just basic engineering, and the engineers weren't using quantum theory to build the TVs. It was rather the quantum theorists had explained it after the fact.
Uh-huh.
They built a theory to explain it after the fact, right? But the theory wasn't the basis of the invention. The invention was made by engineers who work with metal and real stuff every day, and they figure out how to do things better all the time. Um, and so yeah, so there was this kind of real separation between like the theoretical physics and the practical physics. The work of engineers and stuff, which who obviously do great work and build things and make technology, and it gets better and better through repeated action and so on. And things get better and faster and more efficient. But the theory, it kind of comes along afterwards and kind of like claims credit for it in a way. Um, so
We go back there for 1 second.
yeah, go back.
There's
Yeah.
so much. Speaking of sacred cows, there's so much I want to ask you about, but let's just go piece by piece. I want to go back into quantum physics in just a moment.
Uh-huh.
I want to break down this idea. So you're suggesting that the atomic bomb, which has had all kinds of implications from our foreign and domestic policy, even to The Simpsons, which I want to talk to you about in a moment in terms of nuclear power. Um, let's just go with a bomb for a moment here. So
Yeah.
you're asserting that that was not an atomic bomb in 1945. That was just a massive bomb, but it wasn't atomic. Is that and if
Yeah.
that's so, I'm sorry, and if that's so, what would be the rationale? What would be the reason for assuming the Manhattan Project is bogus? What would be the purpose of doing this?
Um, well, I mean the word atomic. I mean, it makes it sound scarier, right? For a start, that's. I mean, that seems to be the big thing. It's like, every week on the news we get told that the Russians are gonna like send a nuke, right? It's been like going on for like 60 years. There's always this possibility the Russians are gonna like send a nuke. But if it was just the Russians are gonna send a big bomb, it wouldn't be as scary, right?
Yeah.
Um, so there's a fear factor to the word nuclear. It has this fear factor attached to it. But there's the story of Galen Windsor, who was this guy. He was the head of nuclear fuel inventory for the USA, and he worked in these nuclear reactors, as they're called, but they had no safety. He was like he would eat uranium on stage, like just to prove the point that it wasn't dangerous, and he claimed to like drink the water from the reactor and go swimming in it every day. And he said all his staff, when the first nuclear reactors, all his staff worked, perfectly happily. They loved their jobs. They were handling the spent fuel and everything, no problems, no health problems at all. And then one day, now I can't remember what year this was, but there was suddenly heavy-handed federal regulations came down and said you can't touch this stuff. You're only allowed 10 minutes exposure a day. It's too dangerous, yada yada. So they shut it all down, sort of based on safety concerns, saying it's radioactive and you're not allowed to go near it. But this guy Galen Windsor went on for years saying, "Look, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not dangerous. It's perfectly safe." And from what I've seen, even mainstream physicists admit this now. They say that they were wrong about nuclear fallout. That Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it blew away in the wind, is what they say. Um, and with things like uranium, there are people out there now selling like small nuclear reactors, like modular nuclear reactors, and they're saying that it's not as dangerous as they were told either. So, yeah, so the whole just the fear factor around nuclear seems to just melt away, like the more you sort of scrutinize the actual theory, and It's just, I'm not denying they have big bombs. As I say, the question is just around the use of the word nuclear and whether it's actually justified. And there was a man called Michael Palmer who did a study on this, and he claimed the bombs actually contained napalm and mustard gas.
Mhm.
And yeah, so um, so yeah, it's kind of like because there's the whole age as well. It's not just the nuclear bomb or the
Right.
atomic bomb; it's the atomic age. We're
Yeah.
told that, like the world changed forever, right, in 1945, and we entered into a new age where we have now knowledge of how to destroy the world. But maybe that was over exaggerated. Maybe they do have big bombs, but they can't really destroy the world. I mean,
Because there's so many implications of that, and that's why I just want to stay with this for a moment. I mean, the Hadron Collider would be one, Chernobyl. I think about War Games, that movie, thinking about my parents, hiding underneath their desks in the 1950s, 1960s,
yeah.
right? It was so many things. If this is just the first prong of five, right? So, so we just stay with this for one moment here. You mentioned that your awakening came in some ways due to COVID, right? And so if you think about even what I mentioned earlier, the idea behind this podcast, um, they have used fear and the spell that it casts upon the population. And it wasn't just COVID, it was 9/11. That was a big one too, right? I mean, pretty much open up any newspaper in the 2000s, the majority of the stories were about terrorism. It's interesting that terrorism has gone away. We solved that problem apparently. But now we had COVID, right? But looming over all of this has been the threat of nuclear war, right? When it comes to mutually assured destruction, that kind of idea. So I just want to stay with this for a moment here. If I understand, by the way, even just culturally in terms of Oppenheimer, right? That movie that came out last year. If I understand what you're saying correctly, it was a bomb, of course, a big bomb, huge bomb. A lot of people died in Japan. It ended the war, even though we're often told it was not necessary. Japan was losing anyway. We'd already defeated Europe, Germany, excuse me. But it was this show of force that has its own mythology, going back to Oppenheimer. And then ever since, it has been this threat that has loomed especially over America, but over the entire world. And it seems to me, if I'm understanding correctly, it was put in place to affect our psyches in such a way that ever after we believe that we have this amazing destructive power capable of destroying all life on Earth, and not just now, but indefinitely because of nuclear fallout. Am I putting this in the correct terms?
That's absolutely right. I mean, it's like they talk about the big red button, right? It's
Right.
like that, they could just at the touch of a button, everything could be destroyed, and your government or your prime minister or your president has the ability to do that, or the Russian president, say. But so yeah, it's a very deep sort of like ultimate like fear, fear factor. But these bombs, even though they are big, they're nowhere near big enough to destroy the whole entire world. They're still very localized when they go off. So, and just in terms of the scale of things. Um, but uh, but yeah, so I think it is a fear factor, and we saw like thinking of the duck and cover drills, right? Get under the table to protect from the nuke. I mean that's very reminiscent of the masking that we saw during COVID, like making children like mask and sit in these like plastic, separators to like be apart from each other. It's also reminiscent of the way like everyone was like treated as a terrorist after 9/11 when you go to the airport and you're getting like searched and going through all your bags and you're not allowed to take liquids on the plane, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Um, it does make you scared. Um, and yeah, I think with all that nuclear stuff, there is a lot of just fear mongering, and it's like nuclear is like a warmonger's wet dream. It's
Yeah.
just like a tool they can use like all the time to like um yeah,
Okay, so
stir.
and am I correct? You have a PhD in nuclear physics, am I correct?
Yes.
It's not like you're a layperson coming out and saying this. I just want everyone to think about that
Oh,
because you're challenging. I mean, at least for me, when I read that, I'm like, what? that was such a bombshell, no pun intended. But it's not coming from just anybody. I think it's important to remind people of your background when when you're saying these types of things, right?
Yeah, but it's also important to remember that even though I have a PhD in nuclear physics, I never once like touched an atomic bomb, or I could never have like built a bomb from my knowledge, right? Because um and there was no, it wasn't like top secret knowledge either. I mentioned that in the book, right? There was like loads of Russians in the physics department, like Chinese, like Arabic people, like people from all over Europe. There was like it's like students from every part of the world, like in the department, like doing PhDs, learning about nuclear physics. So it's not like it was like some like national, sensitive, like powerful information that it would be like a risk to national security or anything like that. Like it's like they literally will just teach to anybody from anywhere in the world this stuff because there's actually nothing you can do with it. Like once you get outside of the halls of academia, there's nothing you can do with nuclear physics, not even build a bomb.
There's so many implications of this. I'm just going to go with one here. I mean, if you think about all of the saber rattling that we've had around North Korea, around Iran, most recently around Ukraine, we have to ask who benefits. And so I'll go back to Oppenheimer and the Barbie movie. I think that came out, both of those, that double feature situation came out last year. So this is just me, contextualizing what you just said because there's a lot to take in. If you think about what that double feature might have meant, right? We, on the one hand, we're reminding the world that the U.S. supposedly has this almost godlike power to destroy, because that's what Oppenheimer literally talks about. That famous quote that he talks about. Now I have the power to destroy worlds, and we've got this movie that's celebrating a perverse version of feminism. This I would just say like just reverse hatred of the sexes, propagating that kind of idea. So we have that going on in the cultural milieu. That's just one place I go to, but of course there's so much more. But I want to go back to this question of who benefits. You began talking about the idea going. I think it was Democritus that came up with the this atomic idea. Although he might not have used those exact terms. This has been around for a while, or at least we think it's been around for a while. I learned obviously about the nucleus, the proton, all the stuff, the electron when I was in school. Um, if it is indeed made up, who benefits from something like that? Why I can understand the fear of the nuclear bomb. I mean, at least I can understand it, even though it's hard to wrap my head around. But help me understand who benefits from the atomic model just in general, presenting that
Um,
philosophy.
I mean, that's a good question. You're getting into like conspiracy stuff at that point. I mean, there are certain organizations that fund science, like the Royal Society and the Ford and Carnegie institutions and the Rockefellers and a lot of this stuff, right? And I won't pretend to know like details about all that. Um, but atomism is actually, so I talk about this in the book, like each of these theories are not just theories about science, they're actually uh, particular religious views which are encoded into the theories. So for example, atomism is atheism. So if you take, because the theory, they express how we relate to God and how we relate to life. That's what is a theory of the universe, right? It's a theory of what the universe is and how it works. So ultimately, it's a theory that everything is made from these little hard balls called atoms. That was what it was originally. And then they then said there's smaller particles called electrons, protons, and neutrons, and then those are what everything's made from. But ultimately, little hard balls of stuff. Now, the thing is, like, to actually claim that that is all there is, that that is what the universe is made from, that's how everything came about, is to dismiss the entire, all the wisdom of the religious traditions and spiritual traditions. And specifically, you're dismissing the creator, you're dismissing the ether from alchemy, you're dismissing the human soul and the spirit, the Holy Spirit or the creative spirit. So all that's getting thrown out straight away, and you're then what's left is this theory of atoms and how atoms manage to create everything that we see in the universe. So it's not just everything consists of atoms, it's everything is made by atoms because there's no creator. There's no there's nothing that's actually creating except the atoms, right? So atomism is really reductionist, materialistic, atheistic point of view, which is formalized into a scientific model. And yeah, so who benefits from atheism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you say this, I know we haven't gotten to evolution yet, but I know you talk about it in this book. And so when I think about what might be behind the evolution theory, and you talk about this as well, is that it's to denigrate both mankind and God, really. This that we come from this primordial soup, we come from this sludge, and it just happened to be a bunch of things bouncing around, right? No divine spark, no creator, as you mentioned. It just happened to be, right? And then because of random mutations, we eventually go from being monkeys and now we're people, but we really just come from sludge, right? So it seems to me there's a corollary here, but around atomism, whereby we come from these things, and so it allows us to dethrone God. I guess would be the way that I would put those in my terms. Is that accurate?
Yes, 100%. I mean, alchemy is real science, but it doesn't dismiss God, and it doesn't dismiss the soul, and it doesn't dismiss the spirit. And this is the thing. The modern science has dismissed all of that. So it's purely materialistic. It sees us as just bodies, just just physical bodies, right? No spirit, no soul, no connection to the divine. So it's an entire theoretical framework built on that assumption. And it's like atomism is like an inversion of Adamism, right? Because Adam, the first man,
Right, right.
it's like so. Technically, if there was a first man, and this gets into the evolution question as well, because in evolution there is no first man,
Mm.
which is
Yes.
a hard one to get your head around. How could there be no first man? How could there be just no such thing as a first man? But if we all come from Adam, then we're all atoms, right? We're not atoms. We're atoms. We're all like a derivative of Adam, the first man. So yeah, it's like they've gotten rid of that completely and said, well, you're just atoms bouncing around in space. And I know that gets into Christianity and everything, and I'm not I don't go to church or whatever. I do read the Bible though because it's full of wisdom, and I really read it to extract the wisdom. But this does it is an attack on God, and science was set up specifically with that purpose. It isn't even really a conspiracy to suggest that. It was like designed to be something purely materialistic that was separate from the church. It was secular,
Mm.
and it was all about number and measure and quantities, rather than the human soul. Right? They took the human soul out of science, basically.
Well, and I think another aspect of this is that we just have a new form of high priests. They possess knowledge that the regular people do not, because most of
Yeah.
us will never get a PhD in nuclear physics. We can't even begin to comprehend the equations that you're talking about. And so we have to take it at face value. And I think that's really underlying this challenge. I know we have four more topics to talk about, but I think when it comes to so many of these things, most of us have not read Origin of the Species. That we're taking it not even directly from the Darwin or whoever, Democracies. We're not reading those direct texts. Instead, we're going off someone else's interpretation, and that is forming our worldview, and that has so many implications for how we live our lives. But one thing that you mentioned, ether. That's not a term that I heard a lot until just recently. And you don't, it seems like it's almost scrubbed from the collective consciousness. So if we could, I want to talk about quantum physics in just a moment, and I actually still would like to talk to you more about nuclear power. But for people that don't know, what is the ether, and how does it fit into our discussion?
Well, it's a kind of an ancient conception. Definitely goes back to the Greeks. Now, with the thing with atoms is, it's not actually certain that it goes back to the Greeks. The Democritus they say he was the first to come up with it, but there is no original documents of this. So it could be something that's been claimed, but may not be true. They try to make things seem older than they are sometimes. Um, but sorry, you were saying you were going to get to quantum physics, but you wanted to ask
Oh yeah. So what is the ether?
the ether. Yes, so the ether is essentially a fluid medium. It's like the substance of space itself. So they propose that space consists of a fine fluid medium. So fluid in the sense that it's able to flow like water, but it's not as dense as water. It's sort of much finer. It's been defined as being like the high air. So they believe the blue sky was a perceptual quality of the ether, like the blueness that you see, which is only very high up in the sky. Um, so yeah, you can think of it as like a sort of fine grade of air. So not necessarily the air we breathe here at the surface, but the air that's like way high up, that glows blue in the daylight. Um, and then the idea is that the four elements, fire, earth, air, and water, all come from this common source of ether. Um, so in that sense, everything is made from ether in an etheric model. Um, Now with atomism, ether gets abolished, like you say, it just gets like written out of history, and they now say everything is made from atoms. So it's like a switcheroo, right? Whereas before, if you'd said, well, what is it? You got a piece of something in your hand. You're like, well, what is it made from? Really fundamentally, well, it would be ether. It's a piece of ether. But nowadays we say it's atoms, right? It's made from atoms. So the atoms have replaced ether, and I began to understand this when I started looking into alchemy, how the atomism view is actually directly opposed to ether. And then there's a number of experiments in history, like the Michelson-Morley experiment and stuff, where um, it actually seems like it was a deliberate attack on ether. It was like they actually tried to put an end to ether with these experiments.
Could you explain that
Um,
experiment? You bring it up in your book, and I've heard of it a few times recently. What is that experiment?
Sure. Well, it was an experiment they did where they they got two laser beams, like so that they believed at that time that the Earth is a globe spinning around the sun, like most people do, and they wanted to prove it. So they got two light beams, one which was going in the direction, pointing in the direction that the Earth is moving,
Mhm.
and one which is pointing in the direction perpendicular. And they reasoned that the light that was going in the direction of movement should experience some ether drag. So at this point, they believed in the ether as well as believing in the heliocentric model. Um, and they thought the light, because the Earth was moving so fast, the light which shines into, like against the direction of the oncoming ether would experience like a phase shift, a measurable shift. And anyway, when they did the experiment, they didn't measure anything at all. So they concluded that ether doesn't exist, right? But the correct conclusion would have been that the Earth isn't moving around the sun, right? But they chose to continue believing that the Earth is moving around the sun, but that there's no etheric medium to create the effect that they would have seen, right? So um, that was sort of one of the experiments where they were basically right. That's it. No one can believe in ether anymore. We disproved it.
Well, the
But
interesting thing that you mentioned about that, most people, sorry, that's, sorry about that. Um, so going back to this idea of high priests and things like that, most people would not know how to even establish the a scientific experiment like you're talking about. Number one. Number two, they wouldn't have the kind of sensitive equipment that would be necessary for them to gauge the results of it. That'd be the second part. Then, of course, would be the wherewithal, the money to do this, right? And then, of course, it would be the understanding of it. What does it even mean? And so, again, I feel like we're dealing with a high priest situation here where here we are, most people don't have any of those resources, nor the knowledge to even determine, first of all, the experiment that would even validate the theory. And then, of course, to understand the answer, and I put that in air quotes, right? And it's
mhm.
so interesting, again, taking it back to COVID for just a moment. Um, most people don't have a medical degree and they can't dispute what they're hearing on television or what they're reading online. And so we're having to take it at face value. and it puts us in a very vulnerable position. I think everything you're saying is very interesting, just to challenge that worldview because most of us just accept this on fact, right? If we're even thinking about it at all, because I don't think a lot of people are even thinking about the ether, right? They're thinking about whatever their next meal, they're thinking about the sports game, they're thinking about getting their kids, and that's not a knock on anybody. It's just the fact of life that we're kept so busy, right? There's so much coming at us all the time that we're not even confronting these vital questions that underlie our reality and our preconceptions. Um, but going back real quick, going back to nuclear power, right? I mentioned The Simpsons. That has been a staple of so much of our culture, but also our understanding of energy. How does this, especially with your background in nuclear physics, how does this inform a nuclear power source? What are the implications there?
Well, the thing is that if you look up how a nuclear power station works, they'll explain it to you. Well, they might explain it to you in a number of ways, but if they're honest, they'll tell you that it works like a giant kettle, right? It works like basically just like a kettle, and you've got a metal heating element in water. It heats the water, produces the steam. The steam drives the turbine, and that's how you get your electricity. Um, so it's quite a simple idea. Now, where what they do is they take you into the quantum realm to explain it to you for a start, rather than explaining to you in real terms. They take you into the quantum realm, so they'll be like at the level of the uranium nucleus. The nucleus is splitting and the neutrons are spitting out, and those neutrons will split other nuclei, and this will cause a chain reaction, and that causes the uranium to give off heat, which causes so they'll explain it to you in atomic terms, but what's actually happening is just there's hot metal in the water which is creating the steam, right? And so it seems like uranium may have the ability to hold heat for a long time and release it, basically take on energy and release it over a long period of time. Like in the book, I call it radiant materials, things like radium. Um, it's kind of like what happens with a bell. You have a bell, it's like you strike it, which is a very short thing, just the strike, but then it rings out sound for a long period afterwards. Well, I think uranium and these heavy metals, uranium is like at the upper limit of density, basically. It's one of the most dense things there is. And I think they're able to hold energy and release it over a long period of time. And that's how the water is heated in the nuclear power station. It's just not as dangerous as, I mean, there will be some danger to it because we are talking about the fire element here, but it's not neutrons and protons spitting out of it. That's just a model.
Okay, so let's go back to quantum physics for just a moment. It's interesting. I believe I heard you on a podcast before we met, and you were talking about the quantum computers are bogus, right? And it just happened to be I'd watched the movie Ant-Man with my kids. I don't know if you've seen it, but they go quantum at one point in the movie, and they become very tiny, and so that's a big part of it. That's definitely in the culture.
They take you in the quantum world, yeah.
Yeah, did you see the movie?
I think I have. Yeah, I watched this some years ago with my kids, though I can't remember it too much. But yeah, they go into the quantum. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I think the second movie is all about the quantum world. I haven't seen the second movie. Anyway,
Okay.
let's go into quantum physics. If that's accurate, I mean, this is my understanding of quantum physics, right? We're basically talking about the opposite of relativity, very small objects, if they even exist, very small things, right? And so almost like they get so small that they're almost like pixelated, and so there is this idea of non-locality, and so there's also this idea of you know, a laser being a photon and a wave at the same time, right? And so it seems to me, just before we get too deep into this conversation, that that's another way. If this is all bogus, it's another way to disempower people, right? Because these concepts, quantum physics, just for the layperson, just seems so opposite of way life works. And seems very hard for us to wrap our minds around. So I just wondered if you could, first of all, explain quantum physics just for the layperson, and then tell us your thoughts about Is that true? Do we have quantum computers? Is any of this true?
Well, I mean, I'll start on the quantum computers because it's a similar fallacy to the nuclear bomb, and it's like, just like they have big bombs, and there's technically no limit to how big of a bomb you can make. There's also no limit to how powerful of a computer you can make, right? Because with parallel computing, it's just, basically it's just a case of money. How much can you afford to build? You can make a computer as powerful as you want. So, um, the public demonstrations of quantum computing have been like really quite patronizing, honestly. They just show you the first one was a big box, looked like a refrigerator, like a big black box. It had all this like steam coming off it and everything, so it looked kind of mystical. And the guy just stands and gives a presentation and tells you about, all the things that it can supposedly do, but there's no demonstration of any power. And even now, there's another one they have, which is sort of looks like it's made of like gold and has all these like little bits. It looks super complex, but again, no demonstration of power at all. Now, just for perspective, I was learning about quantum computing in 1996, which is, a long time ago. And you think how fast technology develops, and I've seen it in my life, like real technology develops very fast. But quantum computing has made no advancements at all. And I think it's just sort of hung there because, again, it's a fear factor. What's scary about quantum computers? Well, if they have them, they'll be able to crack every code.
Right. Yeah. That's what I've always.
Every code. Yeah, yeah. So they just hack everyone's banks and take, your all your data and everything. Like so it's kind of it's an ultimate power in the same way that the nuclear bomb is an ultimate power, right? It's like uh but does it exist? Is it real? Has it been demonstrated? Has the principles been demonstrated? I don't believe so.
I actually interviewed a gentleman who worked at Google on the quantum computing side a few years ago, and so he was, when it comes to all this stuff, he was explaining the idea of a super state, right? If we know what, and maybe I'm butchering this, so I hope I'm saying it right. If computers run on a binary code, ones and zeros, his point was that this is one and zero, right? We're in a super state, we're both. So, he seemed very um, committed to the idea that they were doing quantum computing. And I have to ask them when it comes to the people who are working on nuclear bombs, they're working in nuclear power, the people who are working in quantum computing. I mean, are they all in on it, I guess, or are they all just taken in by the spell? Do they not know any better? I mean, how do we reconcile for people that are working in these fields? How do they fit into this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, people, a lot of people do work that doesn't lead anywhere. I mean, you just need to look in academia for that. People spend years and years and years working on really difficult problems that don't actually amount to anything. Nothing is built, nothing is fixed. It's just, time and effort spent, focusing on mental problems. And a lot of that goes on, and probably in Google and Facebook and all that, I'm sure they have loads of teams of people working on things that never amount to anything, or may just be theoretical, or running models, or doing tests and stuff. But yeah, so I think some people are caught up in it. Some people believe it, but yeah, who is there like some mastermind who's like telling a big lie? Um, I don't know. I don't have knowledge at that kind of level. I mean, I was just coming at it from someone who'd been indoctrinated, started questioning things, and then finding that things are just falling away. The more I question them, it's like the reality of these things I used to believe in literally just crumbles away. And I'm just challenging it and seeing what comes forth. And I mean, in the 8 months since I published my book, no one has come forth in defense of any of these things. By the way, the atoms, the globe, the evolution. I mean, I'm sure I will get someone eventually, but rather I've had hundreds of people thanking me for saying what I'm saying, but no one come forward in defense of this stuff. So, um,
Yeah.
that's quite telling as well.
Okay, let's go back to quantum physics for just a moment. So could you, in the same way you explained the ether, could you explain what quantum physics is, and then give us your thoughts about whether or not this is a pseudoscience? Pseudoscience?
Yeah, so it's quantum physics is modern atomism. So, the term quantum physics didn't come around till like the 20th century, and this kind of like quantum way of understanding atoms, because it's all about atoms, right? Quantum physics doesn't extend beyond the atomic realm. So, it's important to understand that it's like a theory of atoms. But before the quantum theory of atoms, there was other theories of what atoms might look like, and they were more simplistic. Like they just thought it was like a little hard ball, basically. Or there was one called the plum pudding model, which was this idea of like a sort of like a plum pudding. It was a ball, but it had all these like little balls within it, like electrons inside the nucleus or whatever. Um, But so yeah, with in the 20th century, there was a number of experiments, and a lot of these famous scientists like Max Planck and Albert Einstein, and a lot of these guys were proposing this idea that at this level, at the very small scale of reality, things are quantized. So like granular, like discrete, broken up into like discrete steps or discrete chunks.
Mhm.
And the atoms themselves were these objects which had like different states. They would like configure into these different states, like a computer, like ones and zeros and stuff. So yeah, it's almost like a sort of digitization of reality. They've taken, as I say, the ether theory, which was much older,
Yes.
and granulized it into atoms, and then made theories about how these behave. Now, um, the thing that people most think about when they think about quantum physics is the double slit experiment.
Yes.
Um, so this allegedly shows, strange behavior of light, um, and shows that light has this dual nature where it's able to be a particle or be a wave. Now, I've been asked to do a video on this, so I will have to do a video on this at some point. I won't go too deep into it, but my essential view on this is that I disagree with the standard interpretation of it. I don't believe there's any evidence that they're firing particles through these slits. Like I believe it's all just waves, and actually, the paradox here, the whole thing with the wave particle duality is actually a paradox because they're insisting on the existence of these particles. So basically, what I mean is they tell you the particles must be going through the slit, but they never actually prove to you there's any particle there to begin with. Like it's just
Okay.
it's just light, And I've never seen an experiment done with firing like particles one by one through a slit. These are beams of light that they're firing through, and even if they pulse it, so like pulse width modulation, they just let out a little bit of light at a time. It's still a wave. So anyway, what I think is that it can all be explained perfectly well with wave mechanics, which is real physics is always based in wave mechanics because everything is vibration, and wave theory is the best thing for explaining everything. So um, I think a lot of quantum physics just melts away when you let go of this idea that there must be these particles. And I should just say, well, it's just waves. It's all just waves in the ether, vibration in the ether. Quantum physics just melts away. And, it's 100 years old theory. And again, what have we got to show for it? What have we built? What have we created? What have we fixed with that theory? And when I look into it, I find there's really nothing, you know. Just,
Well, I think
I
what you're
mean,
also talking about, to go back to this high priest idea, is the underlying assumptions. So I've heard a lot about this experiment, and I just took it on face value that there were photons, and I don't know. I mean, again, I don't have the wherewithal, I don't have the scientific background to prove or disprove even the basic setup of their experiment. But that reminds me of something else that you mentioned earlier that I want to get into. You spend some time in the book, and I may be jumping ahead in terms of the other categories that we're going to get into, about Stephen Hawking and his idea, his conception of the Earth. I mean, sorry, cosmology. Excuse me. So on the one end, if we're talking about relativity, and that's very big objects like planets and suns acting upon the universe, and then the other end we have quantum physics, very very small things. You mentioned Einstein a moment ago. and I happened to watch a video someone else did to actually take down Einstein. And it seems to me that there are figureheads, great men in history. I think pretty much it's always men. But we have Louis Pasteur, we have Einstein, we have Hawking, Dawkins, we have Newton as well. We have these people, and it seems to me that if we're going on this idea that the nuclear bomb uh, made an impact on our psyche. And there are certain frameworks, certain assumptions that we hold based on that. We also hold them around men, around people that have gigantic intellects that we can't even begin to fathom. And so, I'd like you to spend a moment, if you could, just, I know this isn't a scientific part of the discussion, but when you think about what the cultural impact is of someone like Stephen Hawking that we have come to revere, almost like Fauci, if you will, because he's famously, I am the science. These people become the science for us. And I wonder what you think about Einstein and Hawking and Newton in this regard.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Einstein is a really interesting case because he is, absolutely revered. Can do no wrong. Like everything is measured against, what Einstein would have said or Einstein
Right.
would have thought or what he said. And it was very much like that when I was in uni. Yeah, Einstein is the man. And actually, I remember one of my early memories for how I got into this stuff. I was a young kid, and we got these like magazine periodicals. You get like these periodicals they send out. It was like Mysteries of the Universe and everything. And I was just a little kid reading that, and I read about Einstein and the black holes and the space time and all that. And it was the first time I thought, God, that's really interesting. I want to do this. So Einstein makes an impression on kids and is obviously a very highly elevated figure, supposedly the most intelligent man ever, and all this. Now, everything, all the modern science that we're talking about here is actually held up by Einstein in a way. So the three things he's most famous for in physics are, of course, the relativity theory, which is a modern version of gravity. Okay, so Newton came up with the theory of gravity like 350 years ago, but Einstein then adapted it and sort of generalized it into relativity. So it's kind of an extension of gravity or a modern version of gravity. And then there's the E equals mc squared, which is the relationship between mass and energy, which was supposedly the equation for the nuclear theory, right? How they were able to make the bomb, E equals mc squared. And the one which people don't know about as much, you don't hear people talking about it as much, is Brownian motion, which was the first paper Einstein published. And it's essentially like the sort of random wiggling motion when you look under a microscope, like a sample. There's like things like wiggling around, and he created a theory that said that the wiggling motion was due to atoms, and this basically people took that and said, okay, that's proof that atoms exist. This was, I think, around about 1905, maybe. Don't quote me on that, but around about that time.
Sure.
So Einstein single-handedly then proved that atoms existed, proved relativity, and proved the nuclear theory equals mc squared. Um, but the word Einstein means one stone, right? It's a German word. It means Einstein, one stone. And, you know, we talked a little bit about masonry, and there's this idea of the foundation stone or the cornerstone, right? Which would be the one stone, if you like, the first stone that's laid in a building project. There's like a special ceremony for the first stone, and then everything else, the whole entire cathedral
Hmm.
or whatever, is actually built on the basis of this one fundamental cornerstone.
Yeah.
And then here we have the whole modern view of the cosmos is built on Einstein, uh, one stone, the theories of Einstein. And I haven't actually seen any video of him talking, but I've heard there exists video of him, trying to talk in public, and he doesn't seem like he's the genius we've all been led to believe. So, um, Yeah, I think there's a lot more to Einstein. It's like when someone is that boosted, think about how hard it is to become a public person through your own effort, right? But he's been completely boosted by every, you know, the media, the school system, like everything constantly, like all over the world, like Einstein, Einstein. Why is it so important that everyone needs to know about Einstein and E equals MC squared? Um,
Well, he's a cultural touchstone, I mean, as well. I mean, first of all, he has good branding, if you think about it. Everyone knows that hair. There are certain quotes I can remember being in a Spencer's gift store, and they have the quotes from Einstein about all kinds of things from imagination to what kind of universe we live in. So, going with what you're mentioning here, this is my interpretation. Even going back to the nuclear bomb, these ideas burrow like memes into our consciousness, where they become a shorthand, they become a heuristic, where you say he's no Einstein, right? And so then we begin to shortcut the ways that we view life and think about these things. And you're right. I mean, he is propped up in a certain way, and whether it's deserved, I don't know. That goes back to the high priest situation here. I don't know enough to say like, oh, he's wrong, but I want to talk to you about Stephen Hawking as well, because I found what you said in your book very interesting. And I'm gonna tell you what I remember, and if you tell me if this is accurate, but I want to compare it to Noam Chomsky. And that is this. So I forgot the name of the movie that they did of Stephen Hawking, but obviously it's a very complimentary movie. And I remember thinking at the time when I watched it, it was all bullshit. We're meant to believe that here this guy, this great genius, and of course I don't know how it would even be physically possible, nor do I want to think about it too deeply, for him to have all of these affairs, and right, he's held up as this genius, and he's tortured, right? Kind of like John Nash or whatever. But if I remember correctly, and I'd like you to go into it, um, there's some connection with Epstein's Island. You weren't even sure if that was really him, like if you could explain the computer pad that he uses to talk to us. But the thing about Noam Chomsky I want to mention here, this is just a kind of a working, very crude theory that I have. I grew up kind of looking up to Noam Chomsky, who's this intellectual figurehead. And then in 2020, he comes out and he says that something to the fact that anyone that's not vaccinated should just be left to die, right? And then later, we hear that he had a connection to Epstein, right? And it seems to me, if we're going with this narrative thread, that we have idols, including Einstein, Chomsky for certain people, and then, of course, Stephen Hawking. But it seems to me they could be intellectual gatekeepers, right? You do not go against these people because they're so beyond you. Their intellect, they're geniuses. So if you could, can you talk to us a little bit about the ways in which you debunk the mythology around Stephen Hawking in your book?
Sure, yeah, Stephen Hawking. Well, I when I was at university, I was watching him on TV. It seemed like, there was lots of documentaries, and he was popping up here and there and everywhere. And I believed he was a genius, and I used to think about what it must be like to be as smart as him and all this kind of stuff. But then coming back to it some years later, around about 2018. I saw some documentaries online where they were questioning the official story around Stephen Hawking, and I found even a mainstream media article in the Daily Mail, um, it's saying this, that basically is Stephen Hawking a puppet, like an establishment sort of stooge. And then, yeah, when you start looking into it, well, the title of the chapter in my book is Hawking Isn't Talking, right? Because that's sort of like the wake up call. You realize that actually he's never said anything. You've never actually seen him communicate. Like all we've seen is him sat in a chair while a computerized voice says stuff. And it never even occurred to me the possibility that someone else could have been writing the stuff that the computer's saying. But then when you start to think about it, they say, well, he couldn't move any muscles. He couldn't talk. After like the early 80s, he wasn't able to even make any sounds with his throat at all. Like apparently during the 70s, he was still able to like groan and stuff, but he then lost the ability to vocalize completely. And this was in 1985, he was in CERN actually at a conference,
Hmm.
and he apparently took ill and was rushed to hospital. And they damaged his throat with the tracheotomy, and then he disappeared for like a year, and he was supposedly in care. And then he came back as the sort of wheelchair professor, right, with the robot voice, in 1986, and then quickly followed up with this Brief History of Time, you know, biggest popular science book of its time. And then he was like a celebrity science idol for the next like 30 years, just popping up all over the place. Now, people then start to notice that if you look at him in like in the 1970s or the 1980s, I mean, he's like really skinny. He's like on death's door. His like hair is graying and stuff like that. And then in like 2007, 2010, he's got like blonde hair and he's all like puffed out. He's got like new teeth and this is like many, many years later. Now, his disease, ALS, they say people live only like 2, 3 years, maybe five tops. And he was diagnosed in 1963. So he lived 55 years longer than the maximum life expectancy for his disease. And during that time, he had three children. He had, affairs and a wife and another wife and um, all this stuff. And it's just so unbelievable when you really start looking into it. Um, so diving in a bit deeper, I looked in. He's got children like Lucy and Timothy Hawking, and they were on all the UK TV shows back when he died. They were on like the breakfast shows and this kind of thing in all the papers and stuff. And it was just all very suspicious. I mean, they look nothing like him at all, just nothing like him. And they're very uh, good on TV, shall I say. They look very natural in front of the camera, right, on TV. Like it just all seemed very fishy. So anyway, there's a lot more to it than that, but when you really break it down, there's no proof that he said anything, no proof that he did anything. I mean, he's just a body in a chair, and that body seems to have changed numerous times over the years in ways which are very strange. It could suggest it's not even the same person in the chair. There may be like as many as four or five different models. And then towards the end of his life, he would appear a lot on the news and things like that, and just like talking about things that sound like they're just government talking points, that he's it's like he's just being used to say things on behalf of the establishment. And so yeah, so there was basically a growing number of people were talking about this and starting to expose this, and there's lots of other things that are really fishy about it. And the fact that his physics as well, again, useless. It doesn't do anything. There's nothing you can do with Hawking's physics. It's an extension. It's all based on the theory of gravity, and like you said, when it comes to gravity, there's Hawking, Einstein, and Newton, and that's it. They are the gatekeepers of gravity. It's not. But that's it basically, and that each of them were held up as these huge idols. But when you really look into like what they did, well, they didn't build anything, they didn't say anything. I mean, I know Newton said some stuff, but in the case of Einstein and Hawking, yeah.
I mean, I
So
think the
yeah, it just looks very fishy. Yeah.
no, I mean, and I never that had never occurred to me. But I think the two things really come out when you say that. Actually, more than two, but there's a mythology, right? So there's a mythology about this, and as you talk about it, if I try to remove myself from my own cultural bias, I had read that book. I think I read it when I was in my and when I was in high school. I think is when I read that book. Which I do want to talk to you about black holes in just one moment, but I think what you come back to again and again is the difference between theoretical science and actual applied science, doing something practical science, right? And so there's a lot of mumbo jumbo in that book. I think it makes people feel very smart to be able to be talking about these things and to reference Hawking and Einstein. And it sounds really good, right? When you mention this stuff, especially things like dark matter, which we haven't covered yet, or black holes, right? You seem to be in the intellectual elite that you would even know these topics. But it's interesting. I was reading the fairy tale The Emperor's New Clothes to my son last night. It's actually very fortuitous. you think about that, how were those two conmen able to appeal to the king? Well, it was vanity, right? And literally the part that we ended last night was the two conmen say to the king, well, you will be able to determine who is at your level if they can see these garments, these clothes, right? And it seems to be something going on that's similar here, right? We can tell if you are one of us because you know things like quantum physics, you know about the laser slit test, you know about all of these things that are brought into the milieu, but most people, not you, but most people couldn't explain what they are. They couldn't explain the scientific basis of them, but they sound good, right? If you have a brief history of time, if I had that as a book behind me right here and you saw that, it's a visual cue that I'm an intellectual and that I'm one of the smart people. Same with
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky. He was very much, there was a very much mythology around him. There's a movie that I'm blanking on where they have Noam Chomsky Day, right? Where they, this is this breathtaking intellectual that took apart the American foreign policy. But if I remember correctly, wasn't there some Epstein connection to Hawking too?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, actually, that just came up just as I was finishing the book. That like a bunch of stuff came out in January of this year, um, and there was some photographs of Stephen Hawking with some like really unsavory people at Epstein Island. Now, again, it could have just been fake. There was transcripts that were released apparently where they were he had some proclivities and all this. They were saying that like he liked to watch naked midgets solving equations on a blackboard and all this. Like, and this all just came out in January, and it was just as I was finishing the book, and I thought I've got to drop this in because it's like it could just be complete bullshit, right? Just complete gossip. They made it up. The images could have been fake, but it's just interesting how much Stephen Hawking has fallen, right, from being sort of this like genius through all this to realizing like the guy's never actually said anything, never done anything, and now he's like sitting there on Epstein Island. I mean, there's news articles you can look up where Jeffrey Epstein apparently said he was going to modify his personal submarine for Stephen Hawking's arrival to be able to take him underwater and everything, and yeah, it's just so that's all in the press. And yeah, Jeffrey Epstein held a conference about gravity as well, where Hawking was invited, along with like 21 other physicists were invited out there, and that's all public record as well. So yeah, that's pretty fishy as well.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe I'll save my question about gravity and black holes for just a moment. I want to talk to you about CERN. I'm so glad you mentioned that. So, I was watching this other video on CERN, and I'd love for you to describe what the Hadron Collider is all about to everybody. But what's so weird about the whole CERN situation is the ungodly amount of money that was spent on this facility, and it's huge. Um, and I also remember that there was some, speaking of mythology, that they said that they couldn't create it because there was something like it had to do with a timeline, like that people from the future didn't want us to create it, and that was what was preventing us from creating the Hadron Collider. Then there's also all this weird stuff with Shiva and these people dancing outside. I think there was like a ritualistic murder that was filmed outside of it. The commercial is bonkers that they produced around it. So there's so much to take apart on CERN, but it comes back to, the God particle that they're looking for. Could you please, for those that don't know, what is CERN? And then I'd love for your thoughts, especially around the occult, concerning CERN.
Yeah, well, I don't actually know what goes on there, but I can certainly speculate. I went to a few particle accelerators during my PhD, Jefferson Lab in Virginia, and I went to another couple in Germany. I can't remember their names right now, but no, certainly not the same scale as CERN, but still a particle accelerator nonetheless. But I've seen those. Yeah, the re is it the rededication or something? There's the horrible. They have all these people dancing, and there's a big
Yes.
screen with all the eyes on it and everything. I mean, it's incredibly demonic. Honestly, I cannot watch that video for very long. Like within seconds, it feels like needles in my brain, honestly. It's just awful. It's like, what on earth is going on there? There's obviously some occult aspect to it, but I mean, just to get to the physics, they're telling you they're looking for particles, or then they switched that to they're now potentially opening portals to other dimensions. Remember that the
Yeah,
story changed, yeah. Around about 2020, it was no longer just searching for particles. It's now like opening portals to other dimensions.
yeah.
Of course, we've never actually seen anything come out of those facilities in terms of like anything useful or all that groundbreaking. There's always the promise of the discovery of new physics. Or we're going to discover some new physics, right? It's like, well, have you discovered any new physics, really? I mean, look on the CERN website, it looks like, I mean, it's not very useful. There's not a lot useful on there at all, right? It's like if they have all this power and they're collecting all this data and doing all this stuff, you would think they'd have so much interesting to share and say, but there's really nothing, no fruits, right? No fruits at all. But what's actually happening in an accelerator, right? Where they have basically an electrical current, right? If they have a charged particles going around in a ring, that's an electrical current, and the more power and the more speed they put into it, the more like amps they create. Now, when you have an electrical current traveling in a ring, it produces a toroidal magnetic field. You've seen this diagram before, like if you have a copper coil,
Hmm.
the shape of the
Yeah.
magnetic field that comes around the coil. Yeah, so CERN, being essentially what it is, whatever it is, 26 kilometers
Yeah.
in diameter, actually encompasses the city of Geneva as well, which is interesting. So, you know, or is it the new one? They're building a new one, aren't they? I might have got that wrong. I think they're building a new one which is designed to encompass the city of Geneva. But, so with this huge current going round, they're creating a massive toroidal magnetic field around, like, the city and this area. So I basically think they're using the tech for something else entirely from what they're saying that they're doing, right? So saying they're looking for particles, saying they're opening portals is just deflection from whatever it is they're actually doing there. And it may be something to do with maybe they're trying to protect themselves or charge up the place or something. I don't know.
Well, you mentioned
Speculate.
it's yeah, that's what I mean. It's massive. I mean, I know it's miles long, and I saw some documentary on it. But by the way, it's really interesting what you said. This. Well, I'll pause here and then we'll come back to what CERN is about. There's a part of your book that I think people need to understand, and I hope I'm doing it justice. But you talk about the tree of knowledge, this idea that when it comes to science, especially, we should be looking to the fruit, right? What does it actually produce? When you think about a fruit, it's nourishing, it tastes delicious, it helps your body, and so on, things like that. But when it comes to the science, air quote, that we have from Newton, I'm sorry, not Newton, that's very different. I mean, from Einstein and now with Hawking, there is no fruit necessarily. If you look at the book like, Brief History of Time, how has that impacted anyone's lives in a good way beyond being able to say that you read the book, right? It's not producing fruit. And so I hope I said that correctly. And we need to look at that when we come to all of these mythological figures in science. What are they actually producing for us, right? I'm not sure. And then going back to CERN, yeah, I heard it's miles long, it's huge. So I'm dying to know what could they be doing with all of this money and this space? Like, if it is a subterfuge, what could it be? The real question.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be speculating. I mean, this gets into Switzerland in general, which is, there's there's a lot of really interesting things about Switzerland in general. I mean, apparently all the mountains are hollow and there's like bases in there and everything. And you've seen videos and all that, but they've got,
No.
yeah, like Swiss mountains have got like, just huge like cities and stuff like inside the mountains. It's obviously it was neutral in all the wars. Switzerland is neutral in all the wars. It's like the home of the UN, the WHO, the Swiss banks. A huge amount of power is concentrated in Switzerland even before you get to CERN. So um, I don't know what's going on. I've never been there, but I would say that yes, having a giant ring of energy going like that is going to produce a large magnetic field. And they may be doing experiments or trying to use that for some purpose, but again, I'm just speculating.
Sure. Well, this is a good. I mean, we spent a lot of time on atomism, but there's so much there. So I guess we kind of talked about some of the other things when it comes to Newton, Einstein, Hawking. But let's get into gravity because um, gravity is one of these things. Actually, I want to back up before we talk about it. I don't know if you've ever read Edward Bernays' book Propaganda, but it had an impact. I highly recommend it. It was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and so it's a seminal book to understand the ways in which you influence hearts and minds. And he said the best propaganda that you can have is the propaganda that you don't even realize is propaganda. It's your framework. It's your underlying assumption, right? So when it comes to nuclear bomb, of course, would be one underlying assumption, but gravity to me is probably one of the most seminal underlying assumptions that we have, gravity. So with that said, what are your thoughts there? What is gravity? If does it exist?
Well, when we first hear about gravity in school, we're shown an equation, the equation for the force of gravity, which Newton supposedly derived. F equals g m1 m2 over r squared. I don't know if you remember that, but it's an equation that it's a big deal, and you learn about it, and then that is used essentially in the building of the heliocentric model of the solar system and the calculation of like how far away stars and planets are and all this kind of stuff is all based on this one equation that Newton came up with because he saw an apple fall off a tree.
Right.
Um, now, what's controversial about it is that, again, no fruits, right? So we've had this theory of gravity for 350 years. We can't do anything with it. We can't, essentially, we don't have an anti-gravity machine, right? It's like if we actually understood gravity, it was something we understood, something we could work with, we'd be able to, work with it in some way, like build anti-gravity machines, for example. But there's actually no way to work with it. It's completely abstract. And there's a thing in logic and the virology, the no virus guys like talk about this stuff quite a lot. There's a thing called the reification fallacy, and it's a logical fallacy where you believe something abstract to be concrete. And I found that in physics is a really big problem actually. So and the force of gravity is a perfect example. So things that are concrete, right? If we talk about quantities, like things like length, volume, density, mass, these are things we can measure and we can change.
Mhm.
So, for example, if we change the density of something, we know that it affects the buoyancy. If we have something in water, for example, we make it more dense, it will start to sink. We make it less dense, it will float up. And it's the same in the air as well. Um, so that's something we can control, something we can measure, and something we can work with. But the force of gravity is none of those things. The force of gravity is a calculated quantity. It's a number that's calculated with an equation, and the fallacy is believing that number to be an independently existing force in the universe. And this is where the fallacy with gravity lies. It's like, yes, you can calculate a force. You can always calculate a force because all you have to do is make some measurements and multiply some numbers together, and then you get the force. But that doesn't mean that the force exists as a living, agent in the universe. But that's what they've done. So they've taken something that is essentially just a number, and they've made it into a law, made it into a fundamental force of nature, and then they've constructed an entire model of the universe based on it. And so gravity is a very important one because everything else, all the astrophysics, all the solar system, the size of the universe, the distances to stars and planets, like the nature of stars and planets, like all this stuff is all built on the uh, force of gravity, which is just a number that is not a thing you can measure or control.
But isn't it
So
considered to be one of the four forces? The seminal, I don't, I'm not, the, the gravitational force. Okay, but
Yeah.
I think that's okay.
Yeah, four fundamental forces. Yeah.
Yes. So for the what when we say, why does an object fall down, or why did the ocean stay on the planet, what would your answer be?
Well, yeah. So I mean, again, this gets into alchemy, where we have the four elements: fire, earth, air, and water, and earth and water go down. They basically move down, and fire and air move up.
Hmm.
And this is something that physics completely overlooks. But air currents go up, like heat rises, so fire and air move up, and earth and water go down. And in our normal experience of life, earth and water is beneath us. We go down to the beach or down to the shore. We stand on the earth, and the air and the fire, the light is above us, and that's just how it is. And uh, I understand that again. You can look at something falling and you can calculate a force. That's what I'm saying. You can calculate a force, but that doesn't mean that the force actually exists there. And we know that everything doesn't fall. You can put a helium balloon, for example, will take something like right up. No problem at all. Like it seems to defy gravity completely. Hot air balloons and so on will just go straight up in total defiance of this supposed law or force of gravity. So um, yeah, it just it's a reification fallacy. It doesn't exist. The more you dig and you try and look for this thing called gravity, you realize, well, it's just this equation that Newton came up with. And you talked about four fundamental forces. Well, actually, three of the four fundamental forces are completely bunk. So there's the gravity, the nuclear strong force, the nuclear weak force, and the electromagnetic.
Hmm.
Our electromagnetism is obviously real. We work with it all the time. It's just real. You can prove it. But the other three, nuclear strong, nuclear weak, and gravitational, but those are literally contrived equations. They're not based on observation or measurement. They've been written down, stated, they've been defined. Basically, they've just been defined by the human mind, saying there is this force that exists in the universe and it obeys this equation. So it just made up. I mean, they are just made up, and it's just like it's just how it is. And people don't really use those equations in any practical science at all. It's just theoretical. It's used to build theoretical models, but not used in any practical or fruitful work.
We don't use it for, I mean, when it comes to, and then maybe this is opening up a whole new subject, but when it comes to launching a rocket or a satellite, we're not using any sort of gravitational, I don't know, science around it to help with those kind of endeavors.
Well, I mean, there's you can calculate the force required to like lift something off the ground, right? And then that could tell you about like how much fuel you need and all this kind of thing. So again, because things can be calculated, you can use abstract math to like get from one set of things to a result, right? And that's often how it's used. It's like you use it to get a result, but the result has to be sort of useful.
Mhm.
But the problem is that a lot of abstract math is just believed to be real, as in like objectively existing things in the universe, when it's actually just abstract math. It's just numbers and so on. Um, so yeah, I'm not saying that they can't maybe use the F equals ma or these kind of equations in launching rockets, uh, but it's just a means for doing the engineering, right? For building the things they need to build. But they're not. It's not something they can control in the same way as normal quantities, right? Like mass and length and velocity and all these things, which we can actually observe and measure. The force of gravity is just a calculated abstract quantity.
Well, it reminds me what we talked about earlier, where, I did some consulting once for a company, and they were using some very difficult math to understand. And so this person would talk, and no one in the room could prove if she was telling the truth or not because no one understood the math at all. And so when it comes to something like gravity, and the other entities, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. I mean, it seems to me only a handful of people really understand the underlying science behind it or math. And if I were gonna play devil's advocate and and say, is this possible to get so many people to believe this? Again, it goes back to how many people are interacting directly with the source material. Not very many. Not many people get the PhD in nuclear physics that we're not thinking about these kinds of things in such a deep way that we could even dispute them. Um, it reminds me also when you get you turn your car into the mechanic, he can tell you anything is wrong with it. How are you going to know that that's right or wrong? Same with my computer IT guy. He knows it's such specialized knowledge and information that most of us will never be privy to, will never really understand. So we take it on faith. And if you're right, that would seem to me the way that you would do it because it's so distant from our day-to-day experience that how are we ever going to know if this is true or not?
Yeah. And you say that word mechanic, because it's funny because you have quantum mechanics, right? And it's like, but the word mechanic, if you talk about a mechanic, obviously it's like someone who can like fix your car.
Mhm.
Mechanic is, an eminently practical person who can really fix things and build things. But quantum mechanic can't do anything, like outside the halls of academia, like nothing. And I think the people who are still in academia and they're still getting funding to study this stuff and run these models and everything, they probably think it's going somewhere, right? If they just keep studying, keep doing the research, they'll maybe come to something that will amount to something. Um, but I once you're out of academia and put yourself in the position I was in, which was, I want to use my knowledge to help other people. You very quickly realize that all your quantum physics and everything is no use to anybody. No one's got any use for it. You can't help anyone. I mean, at the very best, you could just like help a student who's trying to learn about quantum physics, right? You can teach other people quantum physics, but you can't actually like serve anybody, fix things like a mechanic can. Whereas you would think, oh, someone with a PhD in quantum mechanics is, this great mind, but actually someone who learned how to fix cars is eminently more useful in society and probably will make more money than than a quantum mechanic.
It's such an interesting world that we live in that up is down, left is right. It just seems everything that you would imagine to be true is not. It's the opposite in so many ways. I think I may be jumping ahead in terms of examples that you talked about in the book, so I'm sorry if I am. But that leads me into thinking about airships for just a moment. And I believe you had a section talking about the Hindenburg. And if I'm understanding correctly, it's not really gravity, it's something that's less dense, floats, right? And so we're seeing that, and then that speaks to the underlying mechanics of why an airship would be able to easily fly around our world. Um, and there are benefits to that kind of a vehicle as opposed to the planes that we have now that require, of course, a runway and things like that. And then I think you also mentioned something I had heard before that there may be something more sinister at play with the crash of the Hindenburg. Um, can you walk us through a little bit of your thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the Hindenburg's an interesting case because there were these huge hot air like airships, so not hot air balloons, but airships, hydrogen gas they were using, and there's footage of those from before World War II, and they're absolutely magnificent as well. Like what a way to travel. And they just sit up there in the sky like hover. I mean, these days we don't really see them much unless it's like the Goodyear blimp or something like that, some kind of novel thing. You might see a blimp occasionally, but those airships like the size of the Hindenburg, absolutely enormous things. And again, they would just sit there. Now, this goes to the flat Earth and the gravity and everything because, well, if the Earth was spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, which is what we're told, then surely when that balloon parks up there in the sky, then the Earth is just going to spin away. And actually, there was a guy. Gosh, I can't remember his name now. He was the guy who was the founder of the Flat Earth Society. Gosh, I can't remember his name. But he basically, before he became a flat earther, he had the idea for the most efficient form of transport on Earth, and he thought it was a brilliant idea. He thought all you need to do is you go up in a helium balloon and you stay there while the Earth spins round and your destination comes round to meet you. So in theory, you should be able to get like halfway around the world in 12 hours, right? All you have to do is just go up in your balloon, stay still, and then the Earth will spin round. And then when your destination comes round, then you bring the balloon back down again. And he was serious. He wrote this whole paper. He sent it to the government. He couldn't understand why no one would take him seriously. He was like, "This is the most brilliant form of like transport." And then he eventually found out that like no one no one would entertain it or talk about it because they knew full well that the Earth isn't spinning. But so well, yeah. So the thing with the airship, of course, yeah, it kind of disproves gravity because they're these huge big things that just hang up there in the air, and can be completely stationary. It can take you all over the world without any need of an airport or a runway. And Yeah, and then with the Hindenburg, they canceled the whole entire mode of transport. Like the all airships worldwide canceled. And you think about that, if you relate it to boats, for example, that would be like canceling all boats because of the sinking of the Titanic, just saying no, it's too dangerous. Taking boats out in the water is too dangerous because the Titanic sank, right? That's effectively what they did. There was one explosion of one balloon, and they said that's it. No, no one can have airships anymore. The whole mode of transport canceled forever. So
Well, just to play
I
devil's
don't
advocate, and maybe I'm wrong about how they work. Is helium? Isn't that helium that's
They were using hydrogen, I believe, yeah, which has more of an uplift force than helium. So, but helium and hydrogen both have an uplifting force, but hydrogen is a stronger uplift than helium. Yeah,
okay? Well, I'm not advocating for John Oliver, but if I remember correctly, he has this funny bit where he's saying, this is highly flammable, and he's like, why didn't anybody ever think about this? Get a match near that, it's going to blow up, right? So, it's been ridiculed, this idea that we ever flew this way. What would you say to that?
I mean, well, yeah, hydrogen, bangs when it's exposed to fire, but yeah, I mean, again, is that any reason to destroy a whole mode of transport like worldwide? It just seems like we still have the choice to whether or not to take that risk, just like we choose to take the risk to go on an airplane. I mean, it's still a pretty risky thing to do, or even just go on a boat. You take the risk, but so yeah, I don't think the fact that hydrogen is explosive is really that much of an issue. I mean, all machines have like explosive fuel in them to some degree, but
Well, because
um,
that's what I meant about earlier about it becomes our underlying assumption. And I don't know enough about airships, but it seems to me if you wanted to continue with this mode of travel, that you would just create some sort of barrier like we have in our cars, so that our cars don't, I mean, they have flammable things, they have gas that could blow up, right?
yeah.
So on the one hand, I can see his logic where he's like, well, why would you ever trust this thing? If you get a match near it, it's going to blow up like it did with the Hindenburg. But on the other hand, we do, I mean, the same thing's true with a plane. Plane has tons of fuel in it. If you got a match near that fuel, it would blow up too. Wouldn't the workaround be to simply put a barrier between the gas and something that could ignite it?
Yeah, I'm sure there'd be yeah plenty of engineering techniques to protect and make it safe. And I mean, we don't know of any other airships blowing up, do we? I mean, I'm not aware of any others. Just that
No.
one.
I mean,
You know,
people don't even think about airships. Until
no.
recently, I never really thought about it, but I think you mentioned in your book, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but think about Antarctica or something like that. These places where, I'm sorry, the South Pole, we're not allowed to go any of these places, right, because of the tree or whatever. Um, but you could go in this balloon and look at it. You don't have to have an airstrip to land on. You could go to places that are remote, and this basically cuts off part of our knowledge, cuts off our ability to be able to travel the world and things like that. It
Yeah,
seems go ahead.
sorry, yeah, the north and south domains of the Earth, which we can't really travel to freely, but it would be perfectly easy to travel there on an airship. Just get in an airship, head north. Um, it's funny because if you look on a standard map of the world, and you go north of Britain. I'm in Scotland, so like if you just go to Scotland and go straight north from Scotland, according to standard maps, there's nothing at all, like nothing. It's just ocean. You just go and go and go until you reach the end of the map, and that's it. And there's nothing but water north of Britain. And in the older maps, there was an ice cap. It looked like there was the North Pole and stuff like that, but now it's just like an open ocean, allegedly. Um, and to me, it just seems like they're just hiding what's there. It's like we can't go. There's no airports. It's like there's nothing on the map. But it's just like that North Zone and the South Zone are sort of hidden from us. And but airships would just open all that up to people. It would make it. It would sort of democratize travel, as it were.
Well, yeah, and I mean, when I think about that, I also think about this push for electric computerized vehicles, right? And so one thing that would never enters the discussions, where again, it goes back to safety. So, the reason that we cut off this entire mode of travel is safety, right? They always use safetyism to do it. Well, the other big argument around self-driving cars is that we're too dangerous. We have too many car accidents. We've got to be in these vehicles. But number one, um, because we're in vehicles and we require roads in the same way we require airstrips to land our planes, most people don't see much of the country anymore. We're really boxed in terms of the amount of freedom that we have. And again, to go back to the high priest analogy, we are just reliant upon these satellite images that are provided to us by Google, a company whose motto used to be "Don't do evil." Right? So we're dependent upon their information. We're not looking for ourselves with our own eyes. And then when you talk about, airships, uh, how amazing would that be? Where we didn't have to be dependent upon paying an ungodly sum of money to get on an airplane, where then you have to deal with the TSA and all that nonsense, right? You can't even have a water bottle that you're bringing through. So that's just its own thing. And then you're really limited as to the amount of the world that you can visit, you can see for yourself. And if I think about it from a conspiratorial standpoint, I want to know more. I want to look for myself and to come to my own conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's like if it was a case of, airships were blowing up all the time, right? It was like, oh yeah, well, every time we built one, it would blow up, or like half the time the airship would explode, or that. But it was just like, no, one airship exploded one time,
Right.
and that's it, banned forever. So yeah, very suspect. And again, this was like right before World War II and all that as well, which we know a lot of things changed around about then as well. Same with going back to the atomic stuff, like talking about uranium and radium and these materials that are able to like glow and like give off heat and stuff. That was available in the stores in before World War II. In the turn of the century, radium was available as a energy source. People could use it to like heat their homes and things like that. And then again, safetyism, like you said, yeah, shut it all down like after World War II. So there was a lot that we seemed to have back then that we don't have anymore. I don't know exactly why, but maybe it's just they just don't want us having powerful things.
Yeah, I'd heard about radium, and of course, there's the famous case of the guy whose jaw dropped out, because he took some radium, and I don't know enough to say whether or not that.
Yeah, the Radium Girls as well. Yeah, the
Right.
story of the Radium Girls. Yeah.
But if I think about it again from a conspiratorial standpoint, it seems to me that if you go back to the idea that we're dependent upon experts in all these fields because we don't know how to do it anymore, you have that one part of it, but the other part is that you have the passage of generations. So neither of us have ever, I don't think you've ever been on an airship. My parents were never on an airship. Their parents before them were never on an airship. I know about it basically because I know about that accident. And I've seen Indiana Jones, and they're on an airship, and I've heard about it, and I know there are pictures that exist. But it seems to me that if you wanted to change society, you do it incrementally, and then generations die out. So now, if they get their way in terms of these self-driving cars, if it's 50 years from now and people don't have their own vehicles that they're powering in the sense that they're driving or whatever, the vehicles are taking them because of safetyism to different places. places that are approved and going into certain areas, a time will come well where the previous generation who did not know that kind of living, they die out. And that becomes our new normal. That becomes the new framework in which we live. And if you wanted to propagate these mass delusions on people, it's just a gradual changing of your understanding of what reality is to the point where we don't even know this kind of stuff. It's almost like when I read your book and I learn about ether, and that's something I haven't thought about in a long time. I'm re-exploring, I'm re-remembering things that were once commonplace, like you said, with radium as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. I mean, yeah, a lot. It's just old knowledge that's like coming back, and maybe with all this internet technology, I feel like that's kind of part of the point of it all is this rediscovery of everything that was like lost or forgotten or hidden. Um, and yeah, so it seems like these theories they have a sort of ideological component to them,
Right.
but also kind of an occulting component where they're actually hiding technology or hiding some kind of powerful knowledge with the theories, as well as kind of indoctrinating you in a particular belief system. About gravity and relativity. So the thing with relativity is it's actually a whole belief system of moral relativism.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it's not just about physics, it's actually about truth
Yes.
itself.
Yes.
And yeah, it takes us into this world where there is no absolute truth.
Right.
And this is sort of stated in this like a foundational principle of relativity, which is that there's no stationary
Right.
frame of reference in the universe, or
Yes.
that traveling at a constant speed is indistinguishable from being at rest.
Right.
That's what they say, and it's all that physics is based on that premise. But I actually completely disagree. I don't think traveling at a constant speed is indistinguishable from rest. And I do believe that there is a felt difference between traveling and resting. But according to physics, there isn't.
Well, that's a really important consideration. I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think that there are plans within plans. If we're going to assume for a moment that this stuff, and I know we haven't gotten to all five of your ideas, I'd like to invite you back, by the way, to cover the last three. There's no way
Oh,
we.
that would be great. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. But you're so right because if we assume that there are people that do know the real science, the real truth, and then we have plans within plans. And I'll give you an example. If you think about COVID for just a moment, there were many ways in which COVID benefited a certain elite. The fact that I'll just give you a few. When a business goes out of business, and now that property is vacant, someone can buy it up for pennies on the dollar, right? We also saw the ways in which we were normalized to accept remote education, right? And there are other bad implications of that. We're normalized to wear masks, and then we see the even further dumbing down of our children, and then of course even more insidious and more terrible things such as vaccine passports and digital IDs, and then this whole idea of germ theory, which I know we got to talk about that too, right? So we have plans within plans, okay? It seems to me that we have plans within plans when it comes to the delusions of science as well. To your point there, it's not only that you come from sludge and you're no better than a monkey, but oh yeah, truth isn't real either. And so when we do these horrible, ghastly things, well, that's okay because there's no real truth, there's no absolute truth. Do as you feel, do as you wish, which of course even that phrase has occult roots, is do as thou wilt, right? That has occult
Oh,
implications as
it
well.
does, and it actually extends back to that same sort of time period of the early 1900s when relativity and stuff was put out there.
Yeah,
Yeah, Aleister Crowley stuff. Yeah, it's all
yeah,
around the same
exactly.
time. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And I want to mention, I want to go further with Aleister Crowley for just a moment because most people, the general people, I'm not talking about the people that may be listening and reading this, they would know who Aleister Crowley is. But people would look at the Beatles album cover and have no idea who that guy is. They would have no idea his connection to uh, what's his the NASA, what's his name? JPL. Um,
Oh, Parsons, was it?
Parsons, yeah. So they would have no idea about that, nor the idea with Rosemary's Baby and all the ways in which, Thelema and Madame Blavatsky, they don't know those type of things. And so I think that what we're operating with as well, is levels of education and knowledge, and they would have no idea where that comes back from, nor the origins of NASA with Operation Paperclip and things like that. That just there's so much knowledge to soak up, and it makes me feel like every day I realize I know less and less than I thought, right? So you have that going on on the one hand, and on the other hand, going back to our culture, we have a culture that's dumbing us down, an educational system that's turning us into kind of obedient robots, right? And so I guess where I'm going with this as well is we have so much potential with the human mind. Whether or not it's true, we only use 10% of it. We have so much potential, and yet we are not being well versed in the real science. We're not being well versed in our real history, and all of these different things. And without those knowledge, without these understandings, we are more prey for following the path that they would want for us. Going back to what I mentioned with the self-driving cars, if you don't know a time before this, if that is your entire framework, that everybody has a car and that car takes us to point A and point B, and never was a time in which people drove on their own. Never was there a time when people had airships and they could go wherever they wanted. Well, then in that way, we're much more controllable.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it seems like a huge like control operation really came down around that World War II period, which again is the beginning of the atomic age. And that's why I started with atoms really to kind of go all through this. So yeah, no, I'm with you 100%.
Well, I
Uh,
know we have 8 minutes to the hour. I really want to go into the other three topics with you, but we can never do them justice if we just try to get it in. So, if it's okay, I'd like to welcome you back. This is an amazing conversation. And where can people check out your work? Where can they follow you and learn more about your ideas?
Great. Yeah, I'd love to come back. This has been a great conversation, and there's so much more we could go into. Yeah, so my website is stephenyoung.uk, and that's Stephen with a V. And I actually just released an update to the book, sort of unofficial second edition, with a lot of grammatical corrections and improvements generally. It's just a much more solid product now. I've written a preface as well for the second edition, and it's got a sort of a snazzy new cover as well. So I just launched that this week.
Okay.
So giving the book another big push. And yeah, all my links and everything can be found on my website. I recently started a YouTube channel, which is sort of a new venture for me, making videos. I've just been doing the last couple of months. So if you want to keep up to date with everything, then YouTube's a good place to do it as well.
Well, excellent. I would love to have you back. There's so much more that we got to cover. We didn't even get into the space program, which is what I really want to talk to you about. So let's
Yeah,
make plans to do that soon. But I just want to say thank you again. This has been fascinating. Thank you, Steve.
it's a pleasure. Yeah, we got really deep into some of those other topics, and we didn't get onto evolution or germ theory or that yet either. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to come back and chat to you again, Michael. It's been great.
thank you.